slideshow mode. Oh, okay. All right. So, interop. You've heard me talk about this over the past 2 days. I've been hinting, not hinting, but I've been sort of broadly saying that we needed to do something with the Interop program. And I tied that together a little bit with what we're doing with the bylaws. So I want to drive into that a little bit deeper today and come up with what I would describe as a modest proposal for rethinking the quote-unquote Interop program that we have today. I want to emphasize that when I say a modest proposal, it's not really a proposal, it's really a straw man intended to produce conversation and discussion and debate, which we'll have the opportunity to pursue in the BoF that follows this later this morning. So what are we going to do? Talk about why we're bothering with an Interop program. Why does the OFA have a role there at all? It seems like it's probably helpful to level set on what exactly we mean when we talk about interoperability and relate that to the program that we have in existence today, which is sort of teetering a little bit. Describe the management structure or the governance model that we have today with the Interop working group and what its role is. And finally, describe what we think might be a path forward and see what kind of reaction we get to that. So the simple answer about why there's an Interop program is because it's built into the OFA's mission. So I promised that I was going to tie this back to the bylaws and the mission, and I've now done that. So when we thought about some of the things, the values that the OFA brings to the community when we were thinking about what our new mission would be, one of them had to do with, accelerating development and adoption, most importantly, of various advanced fabric technologies. And a key part of that, adoption is making the industry feel comfortable that this stuff actually works. And a big part of that is creating some kind of an interoperability or a logo program or a certification program or whatever name you choose to give to it, that gives people the confidence to adopt these technologies and use them. So the key Interop program that we have today has been in the past a key element in driving the development, the adoption of advanced fabrics. So, you think back again, the story I told in the very beginning 2 days ago on Tuesday morning, think back to 2004, and here's this new nascent industry beginning to emerge out of the murk. And people are going, well, that's interesting, but I'm not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it's brand new and I have no idea if any of this stuff works. A key part of that was creating an Interop program that demonstrated that, yes, we do have all the pieces, they do hang together, and they do work. So that imperative, if you will, has not gone away.
But Paul, that hasn't really been accurate for many, many years, right?
Precisely.
We don't. Has anyone in this room looked at the Interop list?
So this is Jason, if you don't mind, this is exactly why we're thinking about what we need to do with the Interop program going forward. It's been on this trajectory forever, and things have changed, and we haven't reacted to that. Let me take a quick look in the rearview mirror here. The basic objective behind the Interop program, as I've said before, was to build industry confidence in what at the time was the newly emerging InfiniBand architecture. At the time, it was driven by the only open source distribution that was available that supported InfiniBand, which was OFED. There weren't broad adoptions of this stuff. The only real way to use this stuff was to download it and use the OFED distribution, which was enabling technology. And the purpose of the Interop program was to verify that the very diverse hardware vendors who were threatening at the time to fracture into multiple different proprietary implementations where nobody would gain any market share and the whole thing would fall apart, was to drive that all together to be sure that we had one consistent software stack that would work with all of the different hardware vendors. That was the objective at the time. Sort of helpful to keep that in mind what the backward looking was. What exactly do we mean by interoperability? I break it down into really two components. I don't think this should be shocking or surprising to anybody, but in conversations about this with lots of people, we wind up wrapped around the axle about, are you talking about interoperability between two devices? Or are you talking about interoperability between various elements of the software stack? And the answer to that is yes. So just for clarity here, we've introduced the notion of horizontal interoperability. If you think about it in a layering theory perspective, there's interoperability between the various layers of a stack. And then there's also interoperability between the layers up and down the stack. That's what I would call vertical interoperability. We're doing both of those. It's important to keep that in mind. A lot of people say, well, there's only one hardware vendor in the IB space, so why do I care about what turns out to be horizontal interoperability? And the answer is you don't. But you still do care about, does the stack hang together and does it work? So there is still an issue, an interoperability issue, even if you're talking about an environment that's dominated by a single vendor. As it turns out, there's more than one vendor, but nonetheless, the point remains. Just to introduce this term, the official name for the program in the OFA has been and always is the Interoperability, OFI Interoperability Logo Program, or OFILP. So keep that acronym in mind, and we'll come back to it. This is a slide I talked about on Tuesday morning, so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this anymore, but this is this idea that we kind of turned the flow of the stream around somewhere along the way. And the net result of that was it has the effect of sort of deprecating the value of OFED, which, again, I want to hasten was a really good thing, because that meant that the open source community had adopted this stuff and embraced it as its own. But that meant that the notion of an OFA-supported distribution called OFED had less and less value as time went on. Not a bad thing, but a reality that's worth mentioning.
So, Paul, just as a side question, have we reached the point where we're going to stop doing OFED?
I'm not going to make that statement today. No, I'm not going to make that statement.
I don't think I've heard anyone really talk about OFA-OFED at all this entire conference.
You're right. I'm going to say no more. At any rate, it's clearly time to rethink the Interop program. So the good and the bad, and a riff on an old Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There is no ugly here, really. It's just good and bad. The bad part is that testing happens today. It's kind of late in the cycle, and it's not aligned with the way that kernel releases happen. So there's kind of a disconnect, which tends to deprecate the value of any testing that we're doing. We're sort of doing testing for our own benefit and not really for the benefit of the community as a whole, or anybody else for that matter. Diminished value in testing hardware devices against OFED, to Jason's point. What's the value in testing against a distribution that is not widely adopted or widely used anymore, because it's largely been self-deprecated. No actual testing against commercial distros. And the way that the program is structured today is that the fixed cost of testing is amortized against a shrinking field of vendors who are interested in having their devices tested against one specific distribution. So that's all the bad. The good here is that this is presenting us with an opportunity to leverage this new distro testing program that has begun to emerge to create some level of synergy between what at the moment are two disjoint programs. One would try to describe as hardware test or vendor-based testing, which is conducted today at the UNH-IOL, and a newly emerging program that we provided to the distros called distro testing, which today takes place at the New Mexico Consortium. But since we're going to pick this program apart and look at reconstructing it, there's an opportunity here to create some synergy, which I think we want to leverage that. So that's the good. There's an opportunity to add some real value to the current kernel release process. This is an input that we got from Doug Ledford, who was instrumental in thinking some of this stuff through. And he pointed out that, gee, there's a real issue here as a kernel maintainer from his perspective in knowing what devices have been tested and to what level they've been tested and have they been tested together. So there's an opportunity there to add something to the community. That would produce increased value to program participants, the community, and the industry, all of which were part of our mission as the OFA. And there's a chance to increase our emphasis on emerging technologies such as Rocky, NVMe, libfabric, to be explicit about doing or implementing programs that support these kinds of emerging technologies. We're doing some of these things today. There is some nascent Rocky and NVMe and libfabric testing going on in the OFILP program today, but I think there's an opportunity to be explicit about incorporating those. I haven't addressed that in this presentation, but it is an opportunity we're going to want to exploit. So the way the program works today, the OFILP, it's really broken into a cycle, which happens twice a year. The cycle is a debug event followed by a logo event, followed by a debug event, followed by a logo event. And round we go, just like clockwork, until it doesn't work anymore. So there's 2 debug events and 2 logo events. And when you pay a subscription fee to become a member of the OFILP, which today, by the way, doesn't require membership in the OFA, you can subscribe to the OFILP totally independent of an OFA membership. But you pay a flat fixed fee and then a fee per device tested. And then we, the OFA, guarantee a certain payment to the UNHIOL that conducts the testing on our behalf, and that cost gets amortized across the devices and the vendors being tested. And you can see as the number of vendors that are taking advantage of this program diminishes, that their costs go up because that same fixed cost is divided amongst a smaller field. And you get to some point when it becomes too expensive for any one vendor, so one vendor pulls out. Now there's, instead of 5 vendors, there's 4, and then instead of 4, there's 3. And pretty soon it becomes untenable economically and it makes no sense, which is a reflection of the fact that the program that we've been providing really isn't meeting the needs of the industry the way we think it should. So the market is telling us what I think we all kind of know. All right, the distro testing program works a little bit differently. This one isn't anywhere near as structured as the existing OFILP program is. It's much more a quote-unquote debug on-demand program where a vendor or distro communicates with the NMC or communicates to the NMC through us more properly, organizes testing, and then they integrate that testing into their normal release cycle, their normal RC cycle, and there's a feedback loop that goes on between the implementers of the testing and the distro that is having his distribution tested, so they iteratively are able to improve the quality of their release, and ultimately they produce a better distribution as a result. So you do this cycle, and then there's a rinse, lather, and repeat element to it. So that's the distro testing program today. The salient point about it is this notion of on-demand testing. It's not on a clockwork schedule like the OFILP program is right now. It is very much driven by the demand of the distro. The time that he needs that program, that's the time when he gets it. Governance model, here's how it works today. Up until not too long ago, this didn't exist, and it was just the IWG, the Interoperability Working Group, drove the OFILP program. The way it works is that the OFA-WG is open to participation by anybody. Doesn't have to be a member of the OFA, it's a public working group. And then that working group asserted control over the OFILP through the mechanism of this thing that I've identified here as the test plan. So they would create a test plan, and that is the plan that the UNHIOL would implement testing against. So the testing would be executed against a test plan defined by the OFA. Everywhere below the test plan level, it's a subscriber method, a subscriber process, so it's a confidential process at that point. So everything above here is public, everything below here is confidential. So it's up to the vendor to say when and if he wants to release the results of his latest logo run as a function of that debug logo cycle I described earlier. Meanwhile, over here, there's this new distro testing program that I just described, which is very much more in demand. And the little red arrow there suggests the opportunity to create some synergy by merging those two programs in some meaningful, significant way. So that's the setup, and it leads us to the question, can we design a program that's going to work better, deliver lower costs, and actually provide some real value to the industry? Again, the logo program did provide significant value 10 years ago. We're kind of run out of the runway of that. So short, is there a program that delivers on the OFA's mission to accelerate the adoption and development of advanced fabrics? I submit the answer is yes. So here's our modest proposal. I went back and forth. The word straw man really should be there. You shouldn't take this as this is the proposal. You should take this as a stone house or a glass house to throw stones at. It's a lot easier if someone puts a proposal up there and we can chuck rocks at it than to make one up. So here's one for us to all chuck rocks at, see what you think of it. What is the scope of the program and who are the stakeholders? The scope is, as always, limited to advanced networks. So we're not talking about testing sockets or TCP/IP or Ethernet. We're not doing that. It's still about software and it's still about advanced networks. So it doesn't include things like compliance to wire specifications. That's what people like the IBTA and the IEEE do, things like that. We don't do that. That's compliance testing. It does include testing of software stacks, and it does allow for testing of interoperability among vendors. Those are the two things that remain the same. Stakeholders, there are a few what I would call direct stakeholders. Existing subscribers to the OFILP presumably would be interested in a revamped, improved program that delivers greater value. Kernel maintainers, we're hoping there'll be some interest from them. We already know that there is because Doug Ledford was a part of developing this proposal. he thinks that there's a lot of value to be had here. Is Doug here this morning? I haven't seen him.
He's next door.
He's doing real work. Yeah, okay. Hardware vendors, I think there's some value there. The distros, they're getting some value from the distro testing program today. By combining that with the existing hardware testing, I think that we can deliver greater value to the distros.
Well, what do you think the value is? If you're saying value, what is the value?
You'd have to ask the distro that. But to them, what they like to know is that their distribution works with the existing drivers. That's what they're looking for.
Usually, yes.
Usually, yes, but not always. But that's what the value is.
I feel the OFA should know what the value is providing.
Okay? There's some indirect stakeholders here. The OEMs, historically, we thought that they would be subscribers to the Interop program way back in the beginning, and it turned out that their response was, no, not really. We look to our hardware vendors to provide that kind of assurance. So it's not really an OEM question, but we think that they will derive some benefit from this, and it will still be indirect as it was before. We think that the upstream Linux RDMA community will benefit from some of this by improving the release cycle. This is the point that Doug made. And Alliance members, OFA Alliance members who have an interest in the stake of the success of the OFA itself would like to see a program like this succeed. So serving our clients, supporting the upstream kernel release cycle, again, I've harped on about that. Responsive on-demand testing, this is to produce a better result for the hardware vendors, and to some extent the distros, because of the circular notion of the way this is going to work. And the logo program provides value to the industry, or it could. It doesn't currently, but it probably should going forward, based on standard Linux distributions. So the stuff that you're using with your distribution, does it actually work? There's some value in knowing that that's true. I'm not going to go through these. It's kind of a detailed list that we started, as I always like to do, with requirements and kind of worked our way down what it was that people were looking for. Upstream kernel pre-release testing. This is sort of a new one that came out of the murk for me, which reflects more than anything my naivety about the way the release process works, but I've been somewhat educated about that. The hardware vendors, they had a certain set of wish lists. One was there is a requirement for a logo program that is effective and useful. Not all vendors want that, but some do. There are some who said, I really do benefit from having a logo. Some said, really, logo doesn't matter to me. The value of being able to debug my stuff in an interactive environment with multiple vendors was more value than the logo. So some it was this and some it was that. The way the existing program works, the debug portion and the logo portion are bundled together, and you get both of them or neither of them. You don't get one or the other. And from a distro perspective, support for testing release candidates against a stable current multi-vendor hardware base. This is what they were telling us they thought would be value. I'm not really qualified to talk in detail about what this means, because I'll ask you to talk to Doug or the SUSE reps who are here about what they think their value is. Anyway, that was the wish list that kind of drove what we were looking for in this program. And that produced a program that looks kind of like this, what I described as a virtuous cycle. To some extent, it's driven by, but not necessarily, by a kernel pre-release testing. You get to a certain RC level, and there would be some value in knowing to the kernel maintainers in knowing what devices had been tested and to what level. Right now, as I understand it, it's a very informal kind of an interaction between the kernel maintainers and the vendors. Does your device work? Yeah, it works. Okay, good. Out of that comes this notion of validated hardware and drivers, which is sort of the logo part of it. A hardware vendor can say that my device has been validated against this kernel release, let's say. And then out of that, we get at the end what I would describe as higher quality distributions. So the distros are able to produce a distribution which they have a higher assurance works in the way that they expect that it will for their customers. So this notion of a virtuous cycle. Upstream kernel pre-release testing, I'm not going to talk too much about this. Maybe I will. Now I'm going to leave this alone. I've already pretty much mentioned it. In the interest of time, let me move on. So here's what we were shooting to do, create a coherent testing program. Up to now, we had these two programs that weren't necessarily in sync, and they were both under the umbrella of the OFA, but they looked like they were, different sons of different mothers altogether. It didn't seem to make any sense that there wasn't a coherent program that took advantage of both of them. We wanted to modernize the Interop program by adding standard distributions. So I've waved my hands about this a number of times. Right now it's driven by OFIT. It really should be driven by the distros instead of by an OFA-created distribution, which is not widely adopted anymore. We wanted to be able to respond to this notion of on-demand testing. So, people don't necessarily want to test on a rigid OFA-defined 6-month cycle, debug logo, which may or may not match the release cycles of hardware and or the kernels and or the distros. Update the program by modernizing the existing test plan. I've heard it said, and I think it's probably true, that the test plan that a lot of effort was put into many years ago, to define the specific test plan has been allowed to kind of languish and hasn't been well maintained. It's been sort of de facto maintained by the UNHIOL. They kind of update it now and again, but that really belongs to the IWG, and the IWG needs to grab hold of that and drive it. Add a distro component to the current logo program. So as we've proceeded down the path of experimenting with this distro testing program, there's been sort of subtle suggestions that there might be value in providing or offering a logo related to that. So you can say that your distribution has been logoed to work with the following vendors. Don't preclude compliance testing. I'm going to sort of leave this alone. Paul Bowden and I, a couple of years ago, did a fairly in-depth discussion of the difference between interoperability and compliance. And it was really in the context of libfabric, where there really isn't a notion of interoperability with libfabric. It really is a compliance thing. Does your implementation comply with the man pages as they're described today? But we don't want to preclude the opportunity to do something like that going forward. And in fact, we're experimenting with that today. There is a program available today where you're able to test your libfabric implementation against the so-called fab tests in an independent way. And last was test against current up-to-date hardware that is constantly maintained. So at the UNHIOL, we had a problem where the cluster was sort of slowly degrading over time. And what we found was it did not have the up-to-date hardware that it needed to have to be of any value whatsoever. There was a heroic effort made by the now emeritus chair of the IWG to get that all updated, which he did through contributions and donations from Intel. Nonetheless, our objective here needs to be that we're testing against current hardware that makes some real sense. So, 2 parts to the program. The first is this notion of pre-release integration testing. It's triggered by a kernel release cycle executed late in the integration cycle at the point when there's really some interest in knowing if the device drivers and devices are working with that kernel release. So probably at the RC4 or 5 level. Freeze the vendors from duplicating tests being run by. So right now the vendors do a lot of this testing in their own labs, as you might well expect. They're busy developing their latest driver and their latest hardware to work with a pre-release kernel, and they're testing against that. But that's on a onesie-twosie basis. Each vendor is doing it independently. Not saying that we're going to replace that, but there may be some opportunity here for some efficiency to be had by doing testing en masse with a bunch of vendors all at the same time in a vendor neutral, if you will, environment. So we don't think that this is necessarily pointed towards the value to the vendors, but we think the vendors will find some value in it. It's driven by an OFA-defined test plan, as it always has been in the past. So we would be able to say to the kernel maintainers, for example, these devices have been tested against this test plan. You now know what you've got in terms of the vendors that you're working with. Interactive test and debug cycle, which is coordinated through the Linux RDMA mailing list. So this is very public. And that's a good reason for that. For one thing, that's the standard mechanism that the community uses for communication, is through mailing lists like that. And there's a lot to be said for, we tested this device against, this RC, and these are the bugs we found, and here's how we're going to fix them. So it's a very public process, very consistent with way that the open source community works today. The idea being that we come up with a kernel release that works well with a set of device drivers that have been tested. So think of it, as I put it in the bottom corner there, as collaborative debugging, which I think is something that the industry could take advantage of. The second part of it is a so-called on-demand logo program. This is kind of an extension of the existing logo program, but freed up from many of its constraints. There's really 2 logos that we're talking about offering. One would be a vendor logo, such as we have today, where your hardware gets logoed. And the other would be a distro logo program. If the distros want this, it's something that they could take advantage of, where we would say, your distro has been logoed against the following sets of hardware. A key part of this is even though the test plan is developed and administered by the IWG, it's executed selectively. So we don't offer a logo that says you get a logo, period. We offer a logo that says you asked to be tested against these tests and here's what passed and here's what failed. So that way the vendor is able to say to his customers, we have a device that works and it executes these tests. This is what it was focused at. This is what it's good for. So there's no subterfuge going on here. It's not like you get to cherry pick and say, I got a logo. You have to say, I got a logo and I was logoed against these tests. So it's very responsive to what the vendors want while still providing assurances to the industry and the value that a logo gives you. Let's see, run against specific distributions. So here's where we start putting in the distributions. So the distros come back here and they would like to test their distributions against the existing devices and see that we've all got something that works. So the two logo parts, again, I mentioned it here. Our new hardware is certified to work with these distros. You're able to say that. Or if you're a distro, you're able to say our distribution has been tested and works with the following hardware devices. So it gives the industry a certain assurance that things are working the way expected. As I mentioned, certification would include these three things, at least. The list of things against which you were tested, the list of tests that were executed, the environment, and what the results of that were. So that's the proposal for the two pieces of the program. How would this be pricing? TBD. I mentioned before how it's priced today. It's not a very effective method. One of the things that we're talking about inside the OFA, and I'm interested in some input into this, is to actually integrate this into one of our membership levels. So there could potentially be a membership level. It says you join the OFA at I'll just give it a name, a testing level, and that gives you access to this program. How it gets priced, if there's a base level subscription that goes along, and then logo testing is priced per run, I don't know. But we shouldn't be thinking about it in the subscription model that we're thinking about today. Let's think about it more broadly in such a way that we come up with a program that is in fact on a cost recovery basis, but that integrates this testing program much more tightly into the OFA itself and our mission. So, next steps. First, you should go ahead and meet our new IWG chair. She's not here at the moment, but she's getting prepared for a BoF later today. Tatyana Nikolova, she's a firecracker. I just met her a couple months ago. She's going to be great. I'm really happy to have her in the role of IWG chair. She's going to be incredibly effective. I'm hoping that you'll come to the BoF a little later today and talk about this. By all means, come with your little bag of rocks and be ready to throw those rocks at it and see what kind of reaction we get. If you're going to throw rocks, by all means, make them constructive rocks. Don't just say this is terrible, I hate it. Come back and say this is terrible and I hate it. Here's why, and here's how we should make it better. But this is intended to be a collaborative effort. Let's come up with a program that works, not just one that knuckleheads like me kind of dictate from the top down. Again, this is just a starting point for us to get going. Make the proposal better. We need to work with our testing vendors on the program details. So the two vendors that we're working with right now, the New Mexico Consortium and the UNH-IOL, we need to integrate them into this process too and see how it's going to fit. We're very careful to sort of keep both of them out of this at this point because we wanted to think about what would demure to the benefit of the OFA and our clients and the community and not have it be driven by the testing vendors themselves. But it's now time to include them. And then eventually this will produce a detailed proposal that will go to the OFA's board of directors and we can vote on it and adopt it as a new program. So join the working group, first of all. That's my first request. And be an active part in driving this forward. And that's what I have to say. Comments, thoughts, suggestions? There's Tatyana. Everybody stand up and give her a hand. Woo! I can tell you they all loved it, so. Okay, questions? Or are you just holding them all for the BoF later today?
Depends whether you want feedback now or later.
Later. Sorry?
I have a super basic question. What does a logo mean?
It means this.
So I can boot either of those OSs and something happens.
And I'm able to say it. Again, you'd have to ask the vendors what they think the value is. This is the feedback that we got. But they're able to say, for a given device, I was able to test it in certain ways, and it worked. And I'm able to tell my customers that. You'd have to talk to.
Rocky and InfiniBand?
It depends on what's in the test plan.
Well, that's a useful statement.
Has it been defined yet? I don't think so.
Is there any concept of how a test plan and all the associated software to support the test plans when they come into the system? That seems like a very big job.
Yeah, so that heads down the road of how the hell does a volunteer organization do something like that? That's a huge task.
The first step.
It takes a lot of money and a lot of time.
It does. The first step is to visualize what you'd like the program to look for. The second step is.
So what OpenFabrics would do is write down the program, and then hand it to somebody else to execute. That was the model previously.
Which it does today.
Okay.
And it would still be that way.
So it's not an OpenFabrics logo. We don't have a rubber stamp here. I don't know why I used the word we. I'm not a member, but it's like, who applies the implementation? The company that is performing the tests. Yes.
Who is it who issues the stamp?
Yes.
It's the independent vendor that does it on our behalf.
Okay.
So it's an OFA logo. At the moment, it says things like UNHIOL on it. I don't know how that would be in the future.
It's published on the UNHIOL website.
Yeah. But these are all great questions that you're asking, Tom, and that's the next level down. How do we make this thing happen?
Great questions. I'm just mystified. You talked about this program, but I have no idea what the value is, who does it, who consumes the logo. It's like if I want to buy an RDMA. I've been told RDMA is good. It must be better if it has a logo. What is that? Who do I? It's like it's just insane stuff. I don't get it right now. Sorry.
Maybe you will.
Well, some customers like it, some don't care.
Okay, well,
So
what kind of customers?
I'm not sure.
So,
No, actually, that's what I'm saying. It's
so,
true.
all right, I work for Microsoft. We have a logo. We do have a logo for drivers that are RDMA capable that we put in Windows. And there's a program of testing that we run that, people who want to have a WICL signed driver go through. And it's a set of tests. It's not perfect, but we run it and, we do it. We don't go around spot about the OFA logo. So convince me that we should add this logo to our requirement and tell me what it means.
Okay, so, even though Doug said what he did,
Wait a minute.
That's great. Okay.
Don, go ahead.
so, Doug may work for Red Hat, but it's not working for RHEL. Okay, he works upstream, and in Red Hat, that's very distinct. RHEL has its own certification process. If this logo program tries to say it's certified on RHEL, you will be getting a call from RHEL. Okay, because that is not our certification. You can't claim that. Okay, so it may add value in that we may change our certification to say you have to pass your approved test here. We could flip it, but that certification or logo will not be a requirement or recognized by Red Hat.
Okay, so I'm hoping that this is the conversation that you'll have in the BoF later
Right,
this
that's
morning.
well, you told me to wait, and then you let Tom go, so I was just...
Yeah,
I really wanted to support Tom's notion that that logo and certification will have big issues.
Yep, okay, that's good.
So it complicates it, it doesn't make it better. Adding a place to do some broad set of testing, and we say, we want you to do that in addition to our certification, which is more like Tom said, it's not very perfect.
Where this one came from,
There could be some big value.
where this one came from, and again, I want to stop here because we're about out of time, but where this came from was there is an existing distro testing program, and that distro has written to us and said, hey, OFA, now that we went through your test, would you be willing to write us a letter that we could publish that says we did your testing? That sounded an awful lot like a logo to me.
Right.
Personally, I was uncomfortable doing that. The previous chair wasn't. She was happy to do that, but I think that that's a pretty sticky wicket when you start heading down that path.
I agree.
So whether or not there is a logo program for distros is something that needs to be discussed. And if there's value in what the implications are, something we need to understand. This is just a reaction to a distro that's...
The fact is, I'm not in the certification part of RHEL, and in that sense, I'm more in the develop space. But I know every time we dive into that as developers, we want to get out of it as fast as we can.
Sure, of course you do.
You see, and he's there too.
Yeah.
So,
But the question we're going to be asking...
sticky wickets, so
The question we're going to be asking ourselves, or asking you in particular, the distros in particular, is there value in some sort of a logo? And if there is, what does it mean? That's what we want to know.
I think that's the wrong question. I think the OpenFabrics should create the tests and somebody else should run the logo program. They're totally different tasks.
We don't run the program. We have vendors that do that for us.
That's great. So then why are you talking about a logo? Why don't you just talk about the tests and what the tests should be?
You know, Tom, I don't even know how to answer that. So I'm going to stop here.
Sorry, I'll shut up. I'm not being productive on this.
All right.
No, I'm not.
We need to stop here, guys. We're behind time and I don't want to get too far behind. And there's a whole BoF time devoted to this. So let me move on. Okay, thank you.